Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the live gathering. There were some tech difficulties in Theater 2 and 3. That's what you get for coming late and not getting in Theater 1. Sorry. Just kidding. We got it worked out. Glad that you can be here. My name is Matt, one of the elders at West Village. It's my privilege to get to teach today, and just everybody else got to ignore me except my family. Miles and Gavin, listen to your mom. Audrey and Gemma, stop fighting. This is the joys of 4 kids and 1 parent in the other theater. Hopefully you kids are embarrassed of yourselves. So just kidding. Love you guys. So yeah, we are really excited to be back in the theater. As you guys came in, there was just an energy of God's people being together, and hopefully you felt that and are just, getting over all the tech difficulties and wearing a mask. Pro tip, if you don't want to wear a mask, come ask to preach, okay? That's what you got to do. And then you don't have to wear a mask. It's one of the little privileges of being up here. But we're going to continue on our 103rd sermon in the series of Matthew this morning, and it's going to be great. I was really excited to dive into this parable together as we really look at, last couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago, we looked at how the religious leaders had neglected their duties in taking care of what God had entrusted to them. And today we're going to look at this parable of the wedding that really shows the Israelites or the religious people's contempt for God's grace. It's going to be challenging at times for all of us, but hopefully the Spirit speaks encouragement and grace and conviction to us. And so the big question that we're going to ask ourselves today is, what will we do with this invitation that Jesus extends to us? And I'll give you the answer now, because I know you only all pay attention for about 5 minutes. But the answer is that this invitation is for all of us, but only the sincere get to stay at the party. Only the soft-hearted and repentant get to remain in God's grace. I'm going to pray for us, and then we can read the passage together. Spirit, thank you for that promise that when 2 or 3 gather together in your name, you will be there. We feel that this morning. We are blessed by that this morning. And I ask that as we come around your word, you will give us soft hearts and just eyes to see and ears to hear what you have for us. May I, as a messenger, get out of the way so that we can hear from you and be challenged and changed by your word, because we know that it's active and alive. So bless us this morning. So if you have your Bibles or your app or whatever you have, turn to Matthew 21. I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 14 this morning. And this is before we dive in, I came across this quote by a guy named R.T. France this week. And he was just kind of talking about what a parable was. And he says this: if the story sometimes verges on the absurd, why not? It is, after all, a parable, not a sober historical narrative. And parables are designed to convey lessons, not to be mirrors of real life. I know some of us, we're very literal people, so we read these parables and we're like, got to find the exact thing that relates, or that seems harsh or extreme, but there is a parableness to this story, some exaggeration as Jesus hammers home points. And this story is meant to serve as a lesson, not a direct mirror of life, as France says. So let's read it together. 21, 1 to 14. Parable of the wedding banquet. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field and another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, how did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, "Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen." Pretty good story, isn't it? Some good twists in there. And as we approach parables, one of the first things I love to do is kind of find out kind of who represents who in the stories. It helps us put some handles on these things. So I have a list just to help us get those handles. So the king in this story, that's an easy one. Kings usually equate to Jesus or God. So the king in the story is God. He represents God in his actions. And the son represents Jesus, the king's son. And this wedding banquet or feast, as Jesus says, it's what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's a picture of salvation or heaven or redemption and being invited into that. And the original guests, the people that refused the invitation, would be the religious people, or in Jesus' case, it'd be the Israelites that he's talking to right now. He's talking to the Pharisees, the good church people in the world. And then we have these newer bad guests, and they're the religious outsiders, those that weren't invited, but ultimately get to come, and godly people. And then we have this weird twist at the end of this improperly dressed guest. And he's really the faker or the insincere, those who claim godliness without repentance. So that gives you some handles of who the characters are in the story. Let's go through it closer together, because there's some things we want to draw out that Jesus wants to hammer home. And it's the first question we see in verse 2, that the kingdom of heaven is like. And this is a common way for Jesus to start parables. And it's a really common theme throughout all of Matthew, this idea of the kingdom of heaven. And we've talked about it lots over the past couple of years. But the kingdom of heaven is an idea that really captures both future implications and current implications. The kingdom of heaven captures the future implications of Jesus is going to bring us to heaven one day, to the true reigning of his kingdom, where we see it fully revealed to us. There's going to be an eternal paradise with no more sin or death or sadness, no more COVID, no more masks, none of those things, right? It's going to be gone, and we get to worship and be and celebrate with him. And that's exciting. It's our common picture of what heaven is, unless your picture of heaven is fluffy clouds. That's not what it's going to be like, sorry. And then it also has some current implications, right? Like Jesus is saying, I am the king right now. My kingdom is breaking into this broken world, and it's breaking into the lives of the church through the church. Really, the church is supposed to be a representation of the kingdom of heaven right here and right now, giving our broken world glimpses, little tastes of what heaven is like. And so with all that said, Jesus is going to talk today about what it means to be invited into that kingdom, what that kingdom looks like get-go. So how we start getting invited into the church here and now, and also how we participate in heaven when we die. And another quote by a guy named D.A. Carson, he highlighted kind of the weight of this parable. It says, if the parable of the tenants, that's the one Andrew preached on a couple, tenants taking care of a farm or field, if that exposes Israel's leaders' neglect of their covenanted duty, this parable of the wedding, condemns the contempt with which Israel as a whole treats God's grace. Contempt is a strong word, and it's a harsh judgment that Jesus is laying on the Jewish people that he's talking to. And we'll see that harshness as we dive in. But let's continue on in verse 2. So it says, the kingdom of heaven is like a king. We know that God is the king in this story. He's the main actor. He's ultimately the hero of the story. Don't miss that. I know you want to put yourself in the hero's shoes a lot. I do. It's human tendency. But it's like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. This is the big event in this story, this wedding banquet or wedding feast. It's a grand festival. It's so much different than, a wedding for us is kind of an afternoon affair. You kind of sit quietly through a boring ceremony, and then you go to a fun party afterwards, right? Like that's what a wedding is in our times. We get dressed up, we have a good time. It was a bigger deal back then. It could be a week-long festival of breakfast, lunch, dinner, everybody coming from far and wide and celebrating over a long period of time this union of the couple. And this wedding is even more of a big deal because it's the wedding of a prince. It's the king's son is getting married. And if you're familiar with the biblical story, you know that heaven is often described like this, right? It's often described as a wedding feast. And this wedding banquet kind of draws people's attention to that. It makes them think of that picture, if you read the Revelation, of heaven being this beautiful wedding feast between Jesus and his church coming together fully. And that's what Jesus wants to draw on here. So that sets the stage for us, right? We got a king, we got a prince, we got a grand feast. It's time to get this party started. So in verse 3, he, being the king, sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet. So traditionally, we all have iPhones and clocks and stuff. We know when they show up on time. I actually applause to all of you because you showed up before 5 after 10 today, which is not West Village culture. Very impressed to see people showing up at 9:30. But with no clocks back then, when the wedding feast was ready, when the food was good to go, you would actually send messengers out to everybody that had been invited saying, hey, we're good to go now. Come, let's get this party started. And so that's what happens here. This is why the king is sending his messengers out. It also makes sure that if you got an invitation by mistake, you don't get a messenger by mistake to get those people rooted out. But so who were these people? These are the king's preferred friends, his allies, those who have the king's favor, those who know him really well, know him best. And the people listening to the story figure out pretty quickly that these are the religious people. These are the Pharisees. These are the faithful Jews. These were the king's chosen people. They were chosen. They received this invite. And it symbolizes this great honor. To be invited to a wedding now is still an honor. It's a privilege. You feel blessed to come in and be chosen by that couple. Even more so back then because it was such a big event in the community. To be left out of it would be kind of shameful. And so this honor of being invited to King's feast and participating in his blessings and his richness is amazing. And you can think even like today, we pay so much attention to like any sort of royal wedding. It's a big deal. It's all over the news articles. I know nothing about these things, but I've heard it happens. And you can think even more so that these royals, this king and his son who were embedded in the community, that were actually known face to face, name to name by these people, how much bigger of a deal that would have been for them. And so you think that those closest to the king would be excited. They would be eagerly awaiting for these messengers to come with the good news that the feast is ready. But what do? They have this shocking response that we see in verse 3. So he sends his messengers to come, but they refused to come. They can't be bothered. It's not that big of a deal. The king, being gracious and kind, thinks there must be some sort of misunderstanding. So he goes on in verse 4 and he says, then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. So the first one was good enough. I'm going to entice them even more. I'm going to tell them that this is going to be the best feast they've ever had. I got my oxen and my fattened cattle all good to go. This is like, the Wagyu beef and prime rib. I'm really getting into smoked meats over COVID. So I was like really going down this path, trying to figure out how good this feast was going to be. But this is not everyday food. This is not even everyday food for a king. This is something special. These animals had been being prepared for a long time for these days. And so he's saying to those invited, look what I've done. You should salivate in anticipation for what this party is going to be like. That this is going to be such a grand feast, and it paints this picture for us of the generosity, but also extravagance of God's blessing. I don't want us to miss this, right? A lot of us read oxen and fattened cattle and kind of glaze over because we don't know what an oxen is, and thinking of a fat cow is not appetizing to us. It's not how we think anymore. We're not browsing the meat aisle at Costco here. But God is such a generous king. He doesn't skimp on his blessings. And if you've heard me preach before, I often mention that as I prepare, there's a lot of different parts of passages that cause me to just stop and have times of worship. And that was this part this week. Caused this moment of awe. I wanted us just to stop and appreciate the rich generosity of God's blessing. I felt in the midst of this, like, I really want to go to this party. I want to be there. I want to experience this king lavishly pouring out on his people. But as we see in the story, some don't want to go, even after this second picture. So in verse 5, it says, "But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business." For the second time, the chosen guests ignore their king. And they go even further, right? They make it kind of rude and personal. They feign this busyness, like, "Oh, I got to go check out this field. It's very important. Or I've got some business to handle. I can't be bothered to uproot my life and go participate in this feast." If you're like me, by this point, you're starting to get frustrated with these guests. Like, why can't they just get it together? Why can't they just go to the party, have a good time, and then come home and then deal with their field and their business? As we hear this story, we so want to think of ourselves as the second set of guests, right? The ones that weren't invited but then got to come. We want to put ourselves in that shoe, that we've said yes to this. But in reality, a lot of us have more in common with these invited guests that ignore the invitation. And so we got to remember that these invited guests, they represent the religious people of the day, the good church people. They know about God and they try to follow his rules. So as you sit here, as you listen in another theater or online, ask yourself, is that you? Is that me? Maybe some questions to help you get there and figure that out are, have you been a part of a church your whole life? Is this just a habit that is ingrained in you? You see a sign up for a gathering, I got to be there. It's just what I do. Are you the one that knows all the right answers? It's always Jesus, so it's pretty easy to know those answers. But does your life look pretty put together on the outside? When you look at your own sin, it's always smaller than your neighbor's, so you're doing well, right? I have those little white lies or whatever. That's not a big deal. I'm not committing adultery. I'm not stealing. I'm not murdering. I'm not doing those things. If those questions resonate with you, pay attention here. Don't wander off like the invited guests did, because it's so easy for us to be distracted from God's invitation into his blessing, into his grace, especially for those who have known him the longest, because it becomes familiar. We forget to be awestruck by it. And so as we think through that lens of what are these fields or businesses that are distracting us from God's invitation, what is more important for us than participating in God's kingdom? And these are examples. A lot of them are good things that we have misplaced priorities in. But I threw a little list together, as I'm prone to do, just for us to analyze these areas of our lives. So the first one that came to mind was family. Especially for those of us with kids, does our parenting style, our kids' schedule override God's priorities and schedules? Do we have to keep saying no to going in mission or being part of a community group or coming to a gathering or whatever it is, because our kids are constantly vying for that top priority in our lives? This is a hard one to balance, because we want to love our kids well and our family well, but ultimately we want God's priorities to override those and trickle down into our parenting. So is your family or your kids a distraction from accepting God's grace? How about your work? We all need to work for a living, earn money, do all those things, something that inevitably has to happen. But does it supersede? Do you pick a job because it's going to give you the flexibility to be with God's people, or do you pick a job because you want to make the most money? There's so many questions that we could go down the road on this one with. But whose opinion matters more? Does your boss's opinion matter more? So you're going to put in 20 extra hours of overtime this week? Or does God's opinion more? And you're going to spend time loving his church, being on mission for him, loving your family well. We've forgotten that invitation. For a lot of us, I know for me, it's comfort, right? I'd rather have my own business, go lounge in that field, if you will, that my happiness becomes more important than God's joy in my life. I'd rather gratify by flesh and make life easy than put myself out there and be sustained by the Spirit and receive fulfillment and joy from him and his work? Or is it arrogance? This is really what it comes down to for a lot of us, right? We think that our will, our desire is more important than God's will and God's desires. We constantly say, yeah, but I don't really want to do that because I don't believe that, or it doesn't make me feel good, or yada, yada, yada. We just go on and on. We make all these excuses when God's invitation of grace comes up against what we want in our lives. I was so thankful this morning. We had no idea how many people were going to show up. A spot for 150 people, 160 signed up. And there's a part of my mind that was like, yeah, people aren't going to want to come because they care more about not wearing a mask or being comfortable at home than actually, taking on those little burdens, if you will, and coming together, putting their will, their desires to death, and having God's desire of being together as his church, hearing from his word. So it made my heart happy to see everybody here this morning. But overall, we see that the human heart, it constantly messes up priorities, right? It's constantly vying for other things to be the top of our priority list, for other things, family, comfort, money, wealth, pride, whatever it is, to become the main lens that we view everything else through. And God's invitation of grace is saying, no, if you want to accept this, you're going to put my priorities first. I'm going to be the lens that you judge everything else through. And our hearts elevate these good things to the point that we miss the invitation into the best things. So don't let the mundane tasks of life seem so important right now, right? Work and parenting and all these things. But don't let them distract you from joining in these extravagant blessings that the King offers you. So if you thought the kind of double rejection of the invitation was bad, there's more twists in this story. Let's go on in verse 6. So they paid no attention, they went off. And it says the rest. So these are the ones that didn't wander off. They seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. It's getting violent. I was talking through this story with my kids this week, and they were very excited about this part because they're boys. And the girls aren't boys. That's true. Thanks, Chris. So this is where the parableness of the story, if you will, starts to come to the forefront. Jesus is really overstating this moment of seizing and killing messengers to highlight a point that the Jewish people, these invited guests, represent, have a real history of mistreating God's messengers, right? They abuse them, they stone them, they kill them. It's looking forward to Jesus' own death on the cross. And he wants the audience to remember these atrocities, to hammer home the point here. It's not that just the religious people ignored God's messengers and his invitation. They actively fought against it. And they mistreat and kill these messengers because they know that if I accept this blessing, it's actually acknowledgement of the king, right? It's an act of submission to him. And they don't want to do that. They wanted to be king of their own lives. They wanted the final say. And their rejection here is actually an act of treason, saying, I'm going to start my own kingdom, where I get my own blessing. And I went back and forth this week on how much I wanted to apply this specific warning and call in this to us. And I think there are some warning here, right? The warning that we still want to be kings of our own lives. And when we say that, we are being treasonous against the true king of our lives in Jesus. But Jesus really meant this section for the Jewish people. It is extra harsh and pointed at them for how the contempt with which they held God's grace. And so I didn't go super deep here, but there's a similar warning later on in the story for us that we will dive into. But let's look at the king's response to this. In verse 7, it says, the king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. This is the action starts to become real, and rightly so that this king is livid, right? He's extending this invitation to come to a wedding, and it results in violence and death. How could he not be enraged? So he sends his household soldiers to bring justice to these ungrateful people, to go stamp out the rebels. It's a really sobering moment in this story, right? It should stop us, should cause us to stop and pause and recognize that this gracious king must also be a just king. We can't just let everybody get away with whatever they want. And it serves as this dire warning that those invited, the religious people, the Jewish people, their hard-hearted, ignorant ignoring of God's invitation will have consequences. And it really looks forward to the day when the Jewish temple is burnt down. A couple decades after Jesus, and Jesus is hinting at these things, right? Like, this is going to come. There's consequences for your centuries of ignoring my invitation into my kingdom. And in some ways, this really feels like the end of the story, right? Harsh lesson learned. The king meted his justice. People did wrong, but God won in the end. If you're familiar with biblical stories, though, they usually don't end quite that simply and easily. In verse 9, it continues on and says, "So go to the street corners." This is the king talking. "Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find." Anyone you find. What an amazing king. Can't let his blessings go to waste. Got this feast ready. People are going to come. Bring anyone in, good or bad. And so if you were one of those that felt convicted or resonated with the chosen guests earlier, don't get trapped in that despair. There's hope here. There's hope here because as much as we may be religious people now, at one point we were all the outsiders that God invited into the party. We were these people that heard on a street corner, "Come. There's a bountiful feast prepared for you. Come partake. Come enjoy." Maybe you didn't resonate with those invited guests at all. Maybe you've always felt like a religious outsider. Still amazing news for you. Come into the party. This invitation still stands today. Come into God's blessing. Appreciate that. We didn't deserve an invitation, but we got one anyway. It's amazing. The party can finally begin. Verse 10 says, the wedding hall was filled with guests. The stage is set at the beginning and we got all these invitations going out, but it really felt like hollow until now. You can picture this grand party going on, smell the roasting meat, see the wine flowing, all these things, people dancing, having a good time, music, just laughter and joy. It's amazing because we went from the story of rejection to celebration. There's a real contrast there. We know that this king so deeply desires to be with his people. And he made a way for it to happen. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel, the good news that we talk about every single week. That God will go to such great lengths to bring people back to him. But ultimately, he will send Jesus to die so that we can come to this party, so that we can have that invitation. Again, we find ourselves at another natural ending point for this story. Like, oh, that's a really good ending. Let's stop there. And then it just gets really weird. Really weird. So let's hammer this home. So I don't even know how long I've been preaching. Verse 11 and 12 says, but when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, how did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend? The man was speechless. Some people like to think of this guy as naked, but I don't think he would have gone in at all being naked. So that's not the case. He's not naked. But just like today, when we go to a wedding, we get all dressed up and we do our hair and we shave and all those fun things. we do that as a sign of honor and respect to the guest and to the wedding, and also just a sign that this is a special occasion. So I'm going to put on special clothes to symbolize that. And really, it shows that you care, right? That you're sincerely excited for this couple and you want the best for them. And so when the king comes in and finds somebody not properly dressed, he's concerned. All these other people got an on the fly invitation and they're properly dressed. They were excited to come in and participate. And as he approaches the guest, I don't know if you guys caught this, but he calls him friend. He doesn't just come confrontationally, he assumes the best of him. He says, "What's going on here?" He gives him a chance. He's a loving king. And then this guest is speechless. He has no defense. And his silence is really loud. It reveals that he is a fraud, and that he's someone who tried to participate in the feast, but is not actually sincerely happy for the wedding. He's there for personal gain. He wants that choice cut of beef instead to actually participate in the celebration. And all of this may seem like a lot to assume from some silence. Matt, you're reading into that. But when we look at the king's response, I think it makes more sense. It comes clearer to us because his response is harsh. You see it in verse 13. It says, "Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" These are the phrases that God uses to talk about being removed from him. This is a picture of what hell looks like: weeping and gnashing or grinding of teeth because of anxiety and despair. He's tied up and thrown out there just because he came in improperly dressed. And it seems so harsh. It seems like such an overreaction. And there is some of that. This is a parable, remember? It's meant to highlight things, to teach us points. So it does that in big ways by making grand comments and gestures. But if we think about this, the guest is abusing the king's generosity. He is stealing something that the king wants to give freely. It is greatly insulting to the king. He's pretending to be something that he's not in hopes of just participating in the blessing and getting a little bit of good food and then sneaking off and doing his own thing. So you can see the insult here. And so in the parable, this fakery, this insincerity reveals itself outwardly in these clothes. It's supposed to be really obvious. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, how does hypocrisy reveal itself in our lives? What does it look like to be an insincere, dishonest follower of Jesus? Together on the outside, rotten on the inside. That's all of us in a lot of ways. But some of us probably fake it more than we wanted. And this is really the main question of the entire parable, right? The invited guests were disingenuous. They were friends or allies in names only, so they didn't come. They were insincere. And it's the same thing with this improperly, poorly clothed guest. And it's a really heavy question to ask, right? How do we know if our faith is sincere? What does dishonesty, hard heartedness look like in us? I don't want to take this question lightly. I don't want to sow guilt or doubt in anybody's heart unnecessarily. So hear that, because some of us are really prone to these things. These questions that I'm going to ask, and you're going to feel shame and guilt, and you're going to doubt if you're saved. It's not my heart today. But we need to ask ourselves, what motivates us to follow Jesus? Because we don't want to get to the party and be thrown out. I realize that for a lot of us, self-analysis is really challenging. It's hard to look inward. It's hard to analyze your heart by ourselves. If that is you, I highly encourage you, get connected to a community group, get in a DNA group, have people that know and love Jesus around you to help you work through these things in your heart. But just like the wrong clothes served as this kind of outward sign of an inward wrong, I came up with some questions that can just help us look at outward fruit and trace them back to any insincerity in our hearts. I have a note here. It says, go slow and be gentle. So um, we'll start with an easy one, though. It says, were you excited to come to the gathering this morning? I know a lot of you were, and that's a good sign. There's a sincerity to your faith that you have joy to be with God's people. You know, to think I was driving here and just thinking like it was quiet out. I was driving to Starbucks to do some prep. It was like 8 a.m. It wasn't that early, but it was just kind of dead in the city. You think that most people are barely out of bed, and the world is just kind of still at that time of day. And how God's church getting up early and doing these things is, yeah, just a sign of their sincerity, their commitment to Him. If you weren't, though, if this is just emotion that you go through because it's been a habit forever, ask yourself why. What motivates you to be here? Is it your wife? Is it religious pressures or a to do list to check off? Ask yourself that question. Next one. Do you leave times of fellowship with believers exhausted or filled? So for me, I'm a pretty big introvert. I get drained by being around people. And a lot of time when I'm going to teach or community group or DNA group, I'm actually not overly excited to be there. And that's part of my own sin, and just how I am around people. But one great blessing, and I've noticed it even more during COVID, because going on a Zoom call is even more exhausting in some ways. But you get to the end of these things and you've just spent time praying and teaching and reading the Bible together or just hanging out and catching up with people. And there is a sense of fulfillment in doing those things in me. So hopefully you would be the same. You can get to the end and you haven't just kind of grinned and borne it through an hour or whatever it is of having fellowship with God's people, but you come out of that and you may have a little bit of physical tiredness, but just spiritually and mentally, you have been refreshed. It's a sign of a sincere faith, of an inward reality, a soft heart. Another good one. When was the last time a spiritual moment brought you to tears? Maybe it's you've been hearing some of those Jesus stories. Maybe it's hearing someone's testimony at a baptism, or last week when we were gathered together in different parks, hearing how God has been teaching people through COVID. Do those well up tears to your eyes? I'm not a crier. I rarely cry, but I've probably cried more in this theater than anywhere else in Victoria. And that was a sign. I had to pray for a long time, like, Spirit, like, my heart is hard in this area. And an act of His work in my life has been that, like, I weep in here more than anywhere else. Nothing to do with this room. It's just to do with what's in this room. So it's a sign. It's one of the questions we actually ask elder candidates, right? Something that we look for. So it's a sign of a sincere, soft heart. Oh, this one. When you finish reading your Bible, do you experience a joyous peace or just this sense of accomplishment that you ticked off that task for the day? Is that time of communion with God around His Word just something on your religious to do list, or actually a time of communion with Him? Maybe it does have tears. Maybe it just has that sense of peace and awe and wonder, and being able to talk to the God of the universe, to the King of the story. And finally, maybe this one hits home more coming out of this COVID season for some. But do you fear death? Are you constantly afraid of dying or getting sick? When you hear that quote, to live as Christ and to die as gain, does that ring hollow to you? Or can you celebrate that? It is gain to die because I get to go to this wedding feast with Jesus. And as I said, these questions are dangerous. They can lead our deceitful human hearts down the wrong path. And the danger comes when we start to use them as a gauge. Have we earned our salvation or not? Man, Matt, I just answered no to 3 of those questions. I don't know if I'm a Christian anymore. If that is going on in your heart, stop right now. It's not my intent. It's not where these are meant to take us to. As this story makes abundantly clear, God's the one that saves. He's the one that sends the invitation. He does the work for us. It's only through Jesus that we can come to this party. So we need to be very careful when we ask these questions and use them just as a gauge of the earnestness and sincerity of our faith. You know, is Jesus all of my life, or is he just an add-on to my life? That's where we want to get to with these questions. And those with humble and repentant hearts shouldn't fear them. Shouldn't fear this examination of our motivations, because we know that Jesus' life is what makes us worthy to get into the kingdom. He died for us to take all of our wrongdoings and give us this perfect life that he lived. It's absolutely amazing. And so we can honestly and joyfully partake in God's kingdom because of what Jesus did. As we conclude, Jesus kind of wraps up this whole parable in verse 14. It says, "For many are invited, but few are chosen." Echoes other phrases of Jesus, like the path is narrow. It's a powerful but short explanation. And it serves as both this encouragement and warning for us. You know, be encouraged that the invitation to come participate in God's kingdom, in his party, it's been extended to you. You sit in this room today, it has been extended to you. And this is amazing news because you weren't even on the guest list originally. You weren't supposed to be there. But now you have the chance to participate in the best party ever. You've been offered salvation from your old life of sin and death and invited into this new life of joy and peace with God, of fellowship with the King. We cannot ignore the warning here. God gets to choose who comes and who stays at the party. And he has no place for the indifferent and the insincere. We all need to soberly look at our lives for areas where we prioritize our own desires over God's desires, where we put on a mask to appear godly. As we start gathering together again, our proclivities to put on those masks of fake godliness, we're going to come out. So be warned now to fight against those habits. Be honest and real with one another as you start to share what's been going on in your lives this past season. Don't be dead on the inside. Be humble and repentant. As I was prepping this week, I was listening to this band, Switchfoot, and this lyric really stood out to me. It says, "What was once routine became the perfect joy." The longer we sit and walk this journey with Jesus, the longer we sit in this church, the more danger there is of our faith becoming this routine, this boring pattern that we find ourselves in. But the call of this parable, Jesus' call on our lives with this story, is to remember the joy that comes of celebrating with the King, the joy of this feast in heaven one day. You know, we're going to get to be with the King forever. We have his blessings through his Spirit now. And let that define your whole life. And to remember that, we take communion. Take it every week we're together with these lovely little cups that we have now, thanks to COVID. But it is a small taste, a small looking forward to of this feast. So you guys are all smart. You'll figure it out. Take the top layer off. Get the little wafer. There's another layer for the juice underneath. And Jesus gave us this symbol so that we never forget this. We do this every week we gather together because we don't want to forget. We don't want to stop looking forward to everything that communion represents. It represents death and life, Jesus' body and flesh sacrificed for us. It also has this element of feast, a wedding feast and banquet that we were just talking about. So as you take this wafer, this cracker, this bread, do this in remembrance the life that Jesus lived for you. We have this juice. It symbolizes this beautiful new covenant that Jesus made with us as people. He died in our place for us, that we could have a holy, perfect life, that we could receive this invitation. As you take this cup and drink it, remember that. Worship him in that moment. I'm going to pray for us. We're going to have one more song, and then we'll be dismissed. Yeah, Jesus, thank you that you're so wise. You take these simple stories and you use them to teach and convict and show us what your kingdom looks like, and it's amazing. So I pray that, these words will sink in, that conviction will come from your spirit, but with that will come hope and encouragement, and revelation of where there's insincerity in our hearts, of where we've been faking it to try to please you. Help us be a soft-hearted, repentant people. Help us be defined by that, because out of that can flow this immense joy of coming and celebrating with you. So thank you, Lord, that we get to be together again as your church. It's amazing. Help us worship you well now. Amen.